Now, so far we've been discussing central police system in the context of homogeneous plane, and on the plane we are assuming that the population are evenly distributed. What if the population are unevenly distributed, especially in urban areas? We know that close to the central city there's a high density of population. When you move toward suburban locations, when you move toward rural areas, the density of population declined. What would happen to the shape and the size of those market areas? And here is a solution proposed by Assad, who is a very famous scholar in the study of central place theory and 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 location and also the regional science and regional economics. Now, he proposed that when the density of population very dense close to central city, you expect that the market area becomes small, but in places where the density of population become lower, the market area of the same services become larger. The reason is quite straightforward because for a particular service, you need a certain number of people uh, to survive. There's a notion of a threshold. To keep that threshold in places with high population density, you would need only a smaller area to satisfy that threshold. And that's why in locations close to central city with high population density, you expect that the market area becomes smaller. But here, when you move to places with lower population density, you would need a larger area to have the same number of customers to meet the requirement of the threshold, and therefore the market area for the same service activities will become larger. So that is a very insightful uh, discovery, very insightful statement concerning the variations in how the population density variation would affect the size of market areas. So this is an important contribution by Esser. Now let's look at some people want to go to the real world to see whether there's any evidence in the real world that largely conform to the conclusion from central place theory. So some people have gone to Western China. In Western China, there's a province called Sichuan province. Sichuan province, there's a big plain in the middle of the Sichuan province. These plains largely can be seen as a homogeneous plain. So on this homogeneous plain, there are some counties, and they look at the shape of the counties and look at the shape of counties. We know in those counties they hold periodical market. So they have this free market that they take turn to hold a free market. And this time, this week is in this town, in this county, and next week is free market is held in another county. Therefore, the shape of different counties eventually was influenced by how the open free market is organized. And when you organize a free market, people would need to travel to the free market. And when they travel to a free market, they would try to minimize the effort to get to the market. So eventually, the shape of the county was also influenced by how the free market is organized, and therefore that eventually people believe that it gave rise to a structure similar to what you would see in central place theory. That is, the shape of counties, some of the counties begin to take the shape of hexagonal shape. Look at this county, look at this county, and it's a county center, that's where they need to organize the free market. This is another county center where they need to organize the free market. Therefore, over time, the shape of those counties begin to take the shape of hexagonal shape, the kind of shape that Koestler proposed for his central place theory in his book. And this kind of shape somehow is, compare this a real shape on the ground with those shapes that you would expect to see in central place theory. So you find some kind of similarity there. So you can arguably suggest that we do see some kind of evidence that support the conclusion from central place theory. Then this is a study that look at how the retail center in a province of Canada, Saskatchewan, how they form this kind of a hierarchical structure. So you have the functions of a service that come at different importance. At the bottom, some very centers that serve very basic functions. This is minimum convenience center and move up to full convenience center. Then you have a partial shopping center, complete shopping center. Then you have a secondary and a primary wholesale center. So when you move up, this function become more complete, become more specialized, and that's why you look at those functions of different levels. You compare with the number of centers that carry those functions. You realize that a more basic function for those centers that serve more basic services, you have a larger number of them. But for those centers that serve more complete services, you have a smaller number of them. So that's exactly what you would expect to see that really conform to central place theory. And this is the map that illustrates the location of those functions of different sizes. You look at those square are those more complete functions. There are only a few of them. But you have this circle, it's convenience centers, very basic function. There are many of them, and they are really close to each other. But for those more specialized functions centers, they are further apart. So really consistent with some of the points from central place theory. And this is a daily urban system from the U.S. federal government. They suggest a system where people daily travel pattern largely surround metropolitan area. So this is a map that is made by using metropolitan center at the settlement center and the surrounding area that provide daily services for people. People would travel from their home to the metropolitan center to work on daily basis. That is what they call daily urban system. So daily urban system can be seen as an example of a central place system that serve people the daily needs of work. So that is also can see that as evidence of a central place system, how people organize their daily life surrounding a metropolitan center, and that eventually we see the formation of this daily urban system across of the United States. Okay, so that's so these are all evidence that we can use to support the central place theory. And remember, when we talk about central place theory, we see that as a theory that explains the geographical pattern of service activity. And individual services, individual consumers, how they organize their life geographically, that can be understood from central place theory. Now, we also have this theory called global cities or world cities. We can see this as a theoretical basis to explain the business service activities and public service activities, also high-end consumer services. You know, we know the central place theory can be seen as a conceptual structure that explains the geographical pattern of consumer service activity. But for businesses, for high-end public services, also for high-end consumer services, these notions of global cities or world cities provide some kind of explanation. Now, let's first define the concept of world cities. World cities, also called global cities, these are the concepts that emerged down the mid-1980s with emergence of this latest wave of globalization. And people begin to see that some cities in the world play a very, very disproportionate role than other cities. And they call these cities that play such a big role as world cities. But with development of globalization since the 1990s and 2000, and the globalization became more kind of a popular term. And therefore, the term of world cities changed to global cities. So today, when we talk about global cities, we also mean the world cities. So these two terms are interchangeable. So these global cities or world cities refer to those cities that play some very important role in global economy, and they are at the very top of the world settlement hierarchy. What kind of activities that tend to be important in global cities? First, you have economic activities. These mostly are business service activities, and they are uh, uh, major financial services, insurance industries, and real estate companies, the big banking firms, accounting firms, and marketing, legal services. So these are all very important activities to serve the needs of a major corporation, big businesses, and they are there not serving the needs of individual consumers, but mainly to serve the needs of big businesses. Okay. Then you have also political functions, and these global cities tend to be the location of headquarters of large corporations and also high-end government institutions such as national government, international institutions, big corporations. Uh, think about Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has the U.S. government and also has the headquarters of the World Bank and headquarters of International Monetary Funds. So it's very important play a very important political functions. And the cultural functions, they are the center of major arts, culture, entertainment, and sports centers. Think about New York City, and it has important performing arts center, the cultural institutions, also the important entertainment center. Think about Los Angeles, and also important sports centers. And also, the global cities tend to have very sophisticated infrastructure. They tend to be centers of multiple transportation modes and centers. And also, they have facilities in communication and transportation that serve not only customers within the settlement, but also in the large areas that surround the centers. And so these are the four important criteria that the people use to identify what cities are world cities and what cities are global cities. So economic, political, cultural, and infrastructure. Okay. So people use these functions to collect data and rank different cities to see how important they are in economic, political, culture, and infrastructure. Then they rank, oh, this is number one, and that is number two, so on and so forth. And so far, there are different scholars, different institutions try to engage in ranking world cities. But different institutions, different scholars may come up with a conclusion that are not entirely the same. So specific ranking could be different among different researchers, different institutions. We just look at a couple of examples here regarding how people rank world cities. This is a example that comes in the 1980s, mid-1980s, where people probably for the very first time they come up with a system to specify what cities are very top of what cities which is not only secondary importance. This is one example of how people rank what cities. Now, in this system, we look at uh, the world cities in different tiers. The first tier, they are called truly world cities. They play a global role. Then second tier, they are only regional cities, and they are only or sub-regional cities. They do not play a very important role globally, but they play a role at the regional level or at sub-regional level. Then you also have third tier city. They are more special. They are more kind of play some specialized function at the regional local level. And also they have a fourth tier. They are called dependent centers. They do not play any kind of command control role. They are dependent upon other cities for their own functions. Okay. Now let's focus on the first tier because the first tiers are the true world cities. Within the first tier, they feel the need to divide cities within this tier into some sub layers. So within this first tier, they first have a dominant world cities. And here you have the top three, the New York City, London, and Tokyo. Then you have a next level within the first tier, major world cities. Here you have Chicago, Los Angeles, Paris, Milan, Frankfurt, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Then you have secondary world cities, and San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and so on and so forth. So this is how, in the 1980s, people divide, come up with these rankings of cities that we call world cities. Okay, so that you have these three subgroups within world cities. The reason for these three cities to be on the top of all other world cities, New York City, London, and Tokyo, is financial. These three cities at that time were the most important international financial centers, and also they serve the needs of investors. They want to have 24 hours a day, 7 days of trading in the global market. So when the stock market closes in Europe, you can move on to New York, to North America. When the stock market in North America stops, you can move to Asia to keep trading in Tokyo stock market. So you can just 24 hours a day without stopping. And that's how the three cities play that kind of role. Of course, in addition, the three cities are also very important location for corporate headquarters and other business services. So not just financial services, they play a critical role in many other areas. But one of the most important reasons for the three cities to be on the top of world cities is that they are all the international financial center at the time. Okay. Then, so this is one example, and this is the map that shows that those three levels of world cities down to 1980s, and this is a map that shows not only the world cities on the first tier, which we call world cities, but also they have shown second tier cities, the command and control center, next tier is specialized producer and service center, and finally the last tier, the dependent centers. And here the red color dot, the circle, world cities. So obviously, back then you have New York City, Washington D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, and Miami are all part of world cities, but they are just at a different level of world cities. In addition, you can see many other cities in the U.S. are in other tiers of this global settlement system. Let's see St. Louis. St. Louis here, at that point, is within the second tier, the regional command and control center. So that where St. Louis sit in this entire international settlement hierarchy. But Seoul is obviously is not part of world city, but it is a regional command control center. Okay. So that is one example. A more recent example is by a different institution, and in this season, they divide the whole international uh, settlement hierarchy into three levels. They use Greek letter to label them, and top tier is alpha, and then you have a beta, then you have a gamma, and now within each of these categories, you can be further divided. For example, in alpha, you could have alpha plus plus, and alpha plus, alpha itself, and alpha minus, just depending upon the importance. And same can be done for those categories that we say beta and gamma. Now let's see world cities. So world cities obviously had to be alpha. So 2012, when they come up with this classification of world cities, only New York and London is on top. We don't see Tokyo anymore. So this is alpha plus plus. Then you see alpha plus, and Tokyo dropped down to this tier. So obviously somehow the importance of Tokyo is declined compared with the mid 1980s. And part of the reason may be that since 1990s, Japan's economy suffered recession, slowdown, stagnation. That's why they suffered a lot of financial loss, and therefore the importance of Tokyo as the international financial center has declined compared with New York City and London. Okay. Also, you have alpha, and you see that within the alpha categories, these are three different tiers. Okay. Now, what you see here is that compared with the 1980s classification, you have more countries from the developing world joined these top levels. So now you have Beijing, Shanghai, Dubai. You also have Kuala Lumpur. These cities from and Mumbai from developing countries join these top three layers of world cities. That is a significant development since the 1990s, and that is probably was really correct to reevaluate the situation. What cities become more significant in the global economy compared with in the 1980s. So this is really more realistic reflection of what is happening in the global economies. Okay, and so this is the map that reflects this alpha of alpha cities. Just on this map, you see more than what we show on last slides, because on these slides, you not only you see alpha plus plus, alpha plus, and alpha, you also see some cities that are labeled as alpha minus. So give you a sense of you have more tiers within the global cities. Okay. Then on this map, you can also see that not only you have alpha, but also beta and gamma cities. So that's is a more complete view of the international settlement hierarchy. So we can use this as a way to interpret the hierarchical structure of business services, also high-end public services and high-end consumer services. So this central place theory and the theory of global cities really provide some kind of conceptual structure for us to understand how the service activities are organized geographically. Okay. And this map gave us a sense of within the United States how this alpha, beta, gamma system work out. So in this context, we can really see it, New York City, Toronto, of Canada, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, Dallas, Atlanta are part of a alpha system. And St. Louis here is in beta. In the beta, you can see beta minus. Again, it's less as important as those in alpha system. Also, there are other cities that are gamma. So that's is give us a sense of how, again, one example of how people use the existing category to rank of cities in this international settlement hierarchy. Now let's look at a particular issue. That is the issue of site distribution in urban system. It is important to look at a urban system as a whole. We sometimes study individual cities, but also geographers study a settlement system as a whole to look at how they relate to each other. In this context, how the size of the urban system, what is the size distribution? Within the urban system, there are smaller cities, there are larger cities, and how the size relate to each other. In this particular context, how we predict the size of cities in a urban system. There are some scholars who come up with a particular way to predict the size of cities in the urban system. And this rule of prediction is called the rank size rule. Specifically, this particular rule allow you to predict the size of a particular city in the urban system depending upon the rank of the size, the rank of that city in urban system. In other words, if you know the rank of the city, you can calculate the size of the city. Okay, so this is a rule that is summarized by this formula. The formula here, the size of a city, well, you can really say the predicted size of a city. This size can be calculated by the size of the largest city in the urban system divided by the rank of the city. For example, we know that in a U.S. urban system, the size of New York City is about 8.2 million. 8.2 million. So we put 8.2 million on the top of the right-hand side of the equation. Okay. Now, if you want to predict the size of Los Angeles, so all we need to do is to use the rank of Los Angeles divided into the size of the largest city, 8.2. For example, here we know in the U.S., Los Angeles ranked number 2, which is the second largest city in the U.S. So we would divide 2 into the size of New York City, 8.2. So we obtain the predicted size of Los Angeles should be 4.1. And the actual size of Los Angeles is 3.8. It's kind of close to the predicted. And in the US, the third largest city is Chicago. And so we divide 3 into 8.2. So we obtain the predicted size for Chicago, 2.7. The actual size of Chicago is actually 2.7. Then if we want to predict the size of Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the US, we divide the 4 into 8.2. We obtain the predicted size for Houston, 2.1. The actual size is 2.1. We can do the same thing for the fifth largest city, Philadelphia. Divide 5 into 8.2. We obtain 1.6 as the predicted size, and the actual size is 1.5, which is close. So obviously, in the context of the US, the size distribution of cities largely conform to the rank size rule. Okay, so if we mark out the size distribution of urban system that conform to the size to rank size rule, we would see something like that. So if the largest city is 1 million, Then the second largest city half a million, and the third largest city will be one third of 1 million, and the fourth largest city will be a quarter of a million, and the fifth largest city will be 20% of 1 million, so on and so forth. So you will see such a declining size. So this is shape from this kind of shape. Okay. So we find out that for some countries, rank size rule seems to work better than others. For example, it works better in the US, in Russia, and China than in other countries. And they look at the US, Russia, and China are all large countries. Also, in those countries, the urbanization have gone through over a long period of time. So they may have enough time for population of different cities to sort it out, to sort them out. That may be a reason that they have a urban system, a size distribution that more or less conform to the rank size rule. And what is the significance of an urban system that conform to the rank size rule? Early on, we talk about central place theory. Central place theory relates the size of places to the kind of service functions that are available at central places. So if places are large, they provide more urban functions to places, to people who live on the places, also for people who live surround around the central place. Therefore, if the size distribution conform to the rank size rule, you can also expect that the service function also somewhat conform to rank size rule. And if rank size rule depict a relatively even distribution of urban population, that also depict a relatively even distribution of service functions in urban places. Okay, so this is we come back to this point when we look at the primary city rule later on. So the significant point that we like to mention in this context is that the rank size rule illustrates a relatively even distribution of urban population. Therefore, it also indicates a relatively even distribution of urban services in an urban system. So in this context, I'd like to make a comparison with the primary city rule. A primary city is defined as the largest city in an urban system that is more than twice the size as the second largest city. Essentially, the primary city is just very large compared with all other cities. It's kind of a disproportionately large compared with all other cities in an urban system. You look at this graph here. Number one city have 1 million people, but number two cities become really small. So that gives you a sense that number one city is disproportionately large compared with all other cities in the urban system. And with this kind of very large, very uneven size distribution, you can imagine that the urban services also comes very unevenly distributed. And a very typical example is at Bangkok, the capital city of Thailand. At one point, Bangkok contained over 80% of the urban population, and therefore it also contained over 80% of college graduates, and the telephones, color TVs, and the cars. So you can imagine all the good stuff that occur in the cities tend to be only in Bangkok. In all other settlements, you have very little urban services. So a very uneven population distribution in the urban system indicate a very uneven distribution of urban services that contribute to very strong geographical inequity in urban services. So that is the point that I like to I'd like to make. Many small and medium-sized countries tend to conform the primary city rule, but it's not all. Not all. So that's, for example, Australia does not really conform to the primary city rule. So that's we cannot make a sweeping generalization. But in most cases, large countries they tend to conform to the rank size rule, and small and medium-sized cities tend to conform to the primary city rule. But that's not a not it's a no clear-cut case in that. It's just a general generalization, general approximation, not exactly true for every single case. So this is a chart that we use to make a comparison between the United States and Mexico. So you can really see on the horizontal axis is the rank of different cities, and also on the vertical axis we see the size of population. So in comparison, the U.S. with the change in rank, the declining population not as drastic as in Mexico. So you can imagine that in the U.S. urban system, there's a more even population distribution than in Mexico. Therefore, you can really conclude that in the U.S., the urban services are distributed more evenly than in Mexico. So that is the point I'd like to make here. Okay. Now let's spend some time to discuss the origin and evolution of cities. We can define cities as a large, concentrated, non-agricultural settlement with high population density and diverse social groups. Here you have several key words. One key word is large. The urban settlement tend to be large in size, so that is the key word. Second key word is non-agricultural. So that is the urban area tend to carry many activities that is totally just not agricultural. In recent decades, we see the emergence of urban farming, and that is an exception. But in general, we define cities as places with non-agricultural activity. So that is second key word. The third key word is high density. And density, the number of people per square miles in the cities are much higher than in non-urban areas. So high density is another key word. Finally, diverse groups. So people who in the cities tend to come from different backgrounds. You could have people who are in different classes, different ethnic, racial groups with different nationalities, with totally different cultural background. So the diverse is another key word that we use to define cities. And that's why cities is a more complex place than the rural area. Yeah. Of course, when we talk about the large in size, there's the issue of how large is large. What is the minimum size that when we come to define a city? We again will come back to the point that we referred to early on. The minimum size differ from country to country, from region to region. For a country that is large in size, minimum size could be very high. But for a country that is very small, the minimum size could be very low. For Sweden, the minimum size for a city is 200. But for Japan, it had to be 30,000. And on average, the U.S. basically uses 2,500 people as the kind of minimum size to call a place a city. Okay, and we know that many places in the U.S. have a settlement. They are really not officially called city. They call themselves villages. So that's. But some villages have a population over 2,500. But because the name would come from history, so they keep the name of village, okay, in for their own settlement. The general point here is that how large to be large really is a differ between different countries. Okay, the origin place can be closely related to the agricultural development. Early on, we talk about there were different agricultural centers in ancient times. There are also different urban centers as well that comes with those different agricultural centers. And within a particular agricultural centers, could have a different um, places that emerge as the cities. For example, in Mesopotamia, you have Eridu, Ur, Babylon, and in the North China, you have Anyang, Zhengzhou as earliest urban settlement as well. So the time of emergence of cities in different regions basically correspond to the time of different agricultural centers emergence. That's why when we see this map, we can really see the correspondence between the earliest urban centers and earliest agricultural centers. Same can be said about the emergence of cities that go along with when the agricultural region occurred at a different part of the world. So this is the timeline that illustrates how the time of different urban centers that are basically consistent with the time of different agricultural centers. This is a map that kind of repeat what we showed early on. So different agricultural centers basically they just those are the places where we saw the first urban centers as well. Okay. The evolution of the city. So after the emergence of early centers, we see a subsequent development of cities. Then here we basically see we can call all these cities as pre-industrial cities. And this is a number of cities that we can see that their major functions are likely to be economical. The more likely they play the role of military functions, religious functions, administrative functions, cultural functions, also the trade centers. Here you have seen the early development across Asia, and also we can see that the decline and revival of medieval European cities. We also see Islamic cities in the Middle East and North Africa. One clear example of Timbuktu. Here, this is a medieval cities in northern Italy, and today this medieval city wall still largely remain intact. This is a slide that shows some pictures of drawings of Timbuktu and 14th century. This is a city emerged eventually down the 14th, 16th century. It became very important Islamic high learning center, and today the city has become declined, and partly due to the desertification and the desert erodes come into the city, in many parts of the city, but you still see some important Islamic mosque and also Islamic cultural centers within the city. And since the Industrial Revolution, we begin to see the emergence of industrial cities, and now the economic function play a very prominent role. They become the production centers, they become commercial centers, really the focal point of economic division of labor. And we know the industrial cities started from the Great Britain and spread to continental Europe and to North America, eventually to Japan and other countries of Asia. So that is the spread of industrial cities go along with the spread of industrial revolution from Europe to other continents. And these are the pictures that are closely associated with early phase of industrial revolution with very severe pollution that is a part of important landscape that we can see that are closely associated with the traditional industrial revolution. Even today, in some countries of Asia, you can still see those very kind of a significant impact of pollution on the landscape. We know many industrial cities in Asia, especially in China and India, they are among the top of cities that are most polluting cities in the world today, partly because of their contemporary modernization and industrialization that repeat the history of some Western countries down the 19th, early 20th century. Okay. Then we see that the so-called post-industrial cities that emerged since the late 20th century, and those cities that played a very important role, not necessarily in industry, but in quaternary services, also in their function in organizing the global economy. They are the important centers of political and cultural and command control centers for the global economy, not necessarily important production centers. Okay, so these are the kind of how we can see the cities have evolved over time. Yeah. And the global cities are clear examples of post-industrial cities, and they play a role not production but organizing in a command control finance a global economy today.